Mr. Jurgenman, would you be so kind as to suggest a prayer?
Hail Mary,
Full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at our hour of death. Thank you. While we are going through class today, I'd like to pass this around. The Rotarian Club of Missouri has an annual Bring High School Students to the Capitol Day. On page 2, it gives you an itinerary. It tells you when you assemble, what you do, when you get out, blah, blah, blah. All of this is going to come down on Thursday, April the 19th. The sign-up sheet is on this green piece of paper. Now, I'll pass this around today. I'll pass this around tomorrow. If you sign it, you have committed yourself. So don't put your name on the paper if you're not sure. There is a cost. The cost is $5, and the Rotarians will pick up the cost of everything else. The Rotarians will provide transportation from Helias to the Capitol, from the Capitol to the Capitol Plaza Hotel, from the Capitol Plaza Hotel back to Helias. So all of that is covered. What you do is all explained in here. Now I'll pass it around again tomorrow. So if you want to wait until tomorrow to sign it, you can. If you say, nah, that ain't my cup of tea, then pass it on. You'll probably notice I have the camera going today. We are filming for all of the baseball players. We're putting all of this on YouTube so they can see what we did in class so that they can stay in the game, so to speak. I believe the last thing we said was that the Allies had landed on Normandy, which is right here, and that the invasion of France had become the turning point of World War II in Europe. After D-Day, the Nazis will not be able to go and stop the Allies anymore. They can slow us down, but they can't stop us. France will be retaken by the Allies in the fall of 1944. In the winter of 1944-1945, the Germans will have one last ditch attempt to divide the Allied armies. They will try to do this in Belgium. The American and British lines will bend or bulge. Thus we call it the Battle of the Bulge. And after that, the end is near. Now here is a map of Europe, and the bulge is going to be fought right there, where that red dot is. The bulge was the last attempt by the Germans to keep the Allies out of Germany. After the German defeat, there is nothing the Germans can do to keep the Allies out. In the spring of 1945, the Allies will meet in Yalta, which is a sea-coastal town on the Black Sea in the Soviet Union. Roosevelt will persuade Churchill to accept most of Stalin's ideas. Stalin has suggested that the Russians be given the glory of taking Berlin. The Russians have suggested that all of the lands that have been taken back by the Allies have elections in which the people will decide what form of government they want. Churchill believes that the Russians will skew their elections so that all of the members vote for the communists, which is the way it actually turned out. It is at Yalta that we decide to have the United Nations. It is at Yalta that all sides agree to an unconditional surrender. There will be no conditions. The Germans will sign the paper, and that's that. In late April 1945, knowing that all is lost, Adolf Hitler will commit suicide. His body will be burned. His body will be blown up so that nothing can be put on display like Mussolini. On May the 7th, 1945, General Jodl, he's the guy in the middle, is going to sign unconditional surrender papers. May the 7th, VE Day, victory in Europe. The war is over. The war is over in Europe. That summer, the Big Three meet for the last time. But the makeup of the Big Three is different. Churchill is still on the left, Stalin is still on the right, but Harry Truman, who had been Roosevelt's vice president, is now president of the United States. Roosevelt will die in April of 45. It is at the Potsdam Conference that all sides agree that Nazis who had initiated the war would stand trial for war crimes. It is understood that the Soviet Union will become involved in the war against the Japanese in August of 1945. And it is at Potsdam that Truman announces that the United States has developed a bomb so powerful that it is the greatest bomb ever produced. Truman calls it an atomic bomb. Now, whether Truman will use the atomic bomb on the Japanese, he has not decided. It was during World War I, it was during World War II that neutral nations like Sweden and Switzerland were hearing whispers that there were concentration camps, that the Germans were rounding up all of the Jews. The Germans were rounding up other undesirables, and that these Jews and undesirables were being put to work in the most horrendous of conditions. They were literally being starved to death in slave labor camps. And then in 42, the news got even worse, that these concentration camps were building wings that were solely for the execution of these undesirables. Now, the trains would arrive every day. Off of the trains would come the people. The people would be divided into two lines. The smaller line would be young men and women who seemed to be quite strong and physically fit. The children, the middle-aged and the aged, the physically and mentally challenged would be put in the much bigger group. They would be told that they had to go to the showers, they were to disrobe, they were to go to the showers, And then once they had taken a shower and had been checked over for lice, they would put on a camp uniform, and then they would go about the work of the day. Put into the showers, the doors closed, poison gas was introduced, and they were killed. The people who were in the first group would then be sent in, pick up the bodies, in most cases bodies of their relatives. The bodies would then be taken to the crematoriums where they would be burned and their ashes spread to the countryside. The Germans took real good records until the spring of '45. When the camps started to be liberated, the Germans stopped taking records. So we know the number is north of 6 million. Now, how far north of 6 million, we don't know. We know that primarily Jews were killed. We know that gypsies and other undesirables were killed. We know that political prisoners were killed. We know that mentally and physically challenged were killed. We know that those of other faiths who protested, Protestant ministers, Catholic priests, Catholic nuns, were sent to these camps and killed. Now, it was decided as these camps were overtaken by the Allies that everything had to be put on film. Pictures had to be taken. Movies had to be shot. Movies had to be narrated by people who were there. Now, Pathé is the largest movie town news in Great Britain. And Pathé did a movie town news in which a member of parliament is going to take you through one of the camps. Now, I have to tell you, this video is quite disturbing.
I, as a Member of Parliament, with 9 others, visited Buchenwald concentration camp. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. No words could exaggerate. We saw and we know. We were able to speak freely with internees and to hear their stories. You will now see a few of the sights we saw, and much as they may shock you, do believe me when I tell you that the reality was indescribably worse than these pictures. You cannot photograph suffering, only its results. In pictures you have no smell of disease and death. Here you see no more than a fragment of the full pattern of horror. When they had died, they were either burnt in these ovens or thrown like vermin into large communal pits. General Eisenhower is now giving each victim as he dies a reverent burial. Many of the mourners are very sick men. On the day before our visit, the deaths had been reduced to 35 during the day. Several nationalities and types, many of them intellectual and highly gifted men and women, were herd in unspeakable conditions which have entirely altered their appearance. In some camps, I'm told, liberated slaves turned against their guards and attacked their quarters.
Now, once the camps had been liberated, as much as could be done to save the survivors was done, but people still died. It was decided that the German residents of the cities around the camps would be made to come to the camps, tour the camps, and if there was a burial, dig the graves for the people who had died. There can be no discussion as to whether the Holocaust occurred or not. There are people who say, well, it's all a figment of somebody's imagination. It's not. There's just way too much evidence. We are fortunate here at Helias in that a survivor of the Holocaust will be here tomorrow to speak to the sophomore class. You probably remember last year when the sophomores went down to the library, and I think it was Mickey who came to speak. Another Holocaust survivor will come. It is important to remind yourself that the Holocaust occurred. Now, because of the Holocaust, we will never know the actual number of deaths. We do know that once the camps were liberated, that the guards, the people in charge, will be put on trial. In some cases, they will be given long prison sentences. In other cases, they will be executed. Even today, we hear stories about where Holocaust survivors have discovered new guards that had been missing the first time the roundup was. Well, in our notes, we need to put some type of a mark to remind ourselves that we're now going to look at the war in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese will go on the offensive. Guam and Wake will fall before Christmas. The Philippines will surrender during the spring of 1942. America was having a difficult time stopping the Japanese. Could Australia be next? Now, more Americans surrendered in the Philippines than any other war in the history of the United States. These American soldiers would be taken to the island of Bataan. Now, the Philippines are a series of islands. They're not just an island, they're a bunch of islands. And the Americans were taken to the island of Bataan, where they would then be put in prisoner of war camps. The Americans would be killed if they could not make the march. The march was about 60 miles. If the Americans sat down and could not get back up during the march, the Americans were killed. If the Americans tried to run away and escape, the Americans were killed. No food, no water would be given out during this march. The Americans were not allowed to take breaks to relieve themselves. If it happened, it happened. But they weren't given time. Mixed in with these Americans are tens of thousands of Filipinos who also were captured. And they too will be placed on the death march of Bataan. Well, what about the head honcho? What about Douglas MacArthur? Douglas MacArthur was ordered off of the Philippines by President Roosevelt. MacArthur didn't want to go, but MacArthur left anyway. When MacArthur is safely in Australia, he will send a radio message to the Filipinos telling them that he will return. Now, for the next 2 years, as America begins to try to build a Filipino resistance to the Japanese, so that one Filipino can identify themselves with another Filipino as resistant fighters. They were given cigarettes, they were given candy bars, they were given chewing gum, and on the wrappers it would say, "I shall return." MacArthur will return someday. In the summer of 1942, the Americans cracked the Japanese Naval Code. Now, if you want to communicate with somebody over there, and you don't want anybody else to understand what you're saying, you put it into a code. Codes are always a series of numbers. And what a code breaker does is a code breaker looks at the numbers and figure out what number represents what letter and what number is just a number. In 1942, we had broken the Japanese code, and we had discovered that the next target was going to be Midway. Now, geologically, Midway is the northernmost Hawaiian island, and then 1,000 miles south of that is the southernmost Hawaiian island, which is Hawaii. So from Midway, the Japanese could launch an attack on the Hawaiian Islands, and maybe they would be unenforceable. The Americans decide to take everything, every single ship that they have left, they put them off the coast of Midway, and when the Japanese show up, it is a great naval battle. The Americans will lose 1 aircraft carrier, but the Japanese will lose 4. We say that Midway is the turning point in the war against the Japanese. Now, we said yesterday that D-Day was the turning point in Europe. Midway is the turning point against the Japanese. Now, turning point means that no longer will they be able to go on the offense. They'll have to be on the defense. And you will now be on the offense. The other guy is on the defense. Now please understand, the war is going to go until August of 45. So we have 3 more hard years of fighting. But we have turned the corner. Now here is a map of the Pacific. The chances of this map being on the quiz next week is 100%. Here are the Philippine Islands right here. Now again, the Philippine Islands are thousands of islands. Guam, Wake is part of the Marshall Islands, and that would be Midway. Now, of the 4, the most important would be Midway and the Philippines. We've already seen a battle for Midway, and we will see tomorrow a battle for the Philippines. Luckily, the battle for Guam and the Marshall is not as big. We know from the previous lesson that all of this land here is fair game, as well as the battle at Pearl Harbor. Let me erase all this. This is what Japanese occupied lands look like in August of 1942. By August of 1945, the war is over. Now, unlike the war in Europe, this is an American show. We don't have to worry about negotiating with the Brits. We don't have to worry about negotiating with the Soviets. They're all fighting for their lives in Europe with us. This is an all-American show. Yet, we are still going to have conferences. Now, we had to have conferences in Europe because the 3 guys didn't like each other. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. We have to have conferences in the Pacific because the Army can't stand the Navy, and the Navy can't stand the Army. And those are the two principal fighting forces in the Pacific Ocean. So tomorrow, we're going to look at the war against the Japanese. We'll probably also start the war on the home front. On Friday, hopefully we can finish lesson 26. Again, we will have a quiz next week. If I had my druthers, I'd rather have it on Tuesday, but I won't be able to decide that until probably tomorrow or Friday at the latest. Okay? Our bell for dismissal is in about 4 minutes.